Without further ado, please let me introduce Dr. Stephanie O'Rourke, who is in School of Art History, and she specializes in 18th and 19th century European visual culture, and in particular, the relation to scientific knowledge, spectatorship, and media technologies. Her first book, Art, Science, and the Body in Early Romanticism, examines the relationship between art and the production of scientific knowledge at the dawn of the 19th century. Her second book examines how late 18th and early 19th century European artists engaged with challenging ideas about history of natural world and how these ideas shaped, in turn, their understanding of human history. And today we are very lucky to have her with us, and she will be talking to us about the art of extraction in 19th century Europe and how artists took up questions of humanity in their paintings. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest for today, Dr. Stephanie O'Rourke. Stephanie, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Amelia. This is my first time at one of the energy cafes, so I'm looking forward to seeing how this unfolds and seeing the rest of the really exciting program for the coming semester. So as Amelia mentioned, or as I hope is clear, I'm not, a historian of energy or a historian of environmental history. I'm really an art historian, and as Amelia suggested, what I'm going to talk about is just some material from the second book that I'm working on, which is not really about energy as such, but which looks at how artworks sort of mediated and transformed changing ideas about the history of the natural world and human history at the moment, not only of the ascendance of industrial manufacturing in Western Europe, but also the consolidation of history as a humanistic academic discipline. So histories are kind of linking concept that I use to talk about a number of things like evolution and scale effects in chronographic diagrams. And so I'm just going to really speak today about forest management in France. And again, actually, very briefly, I'll kind of sketch out some of the things that I find interesting about it, and also German mining and geology. So I will go ahead and bring up a PowerPoint. One thing I find really interesting about this period is, that well into the 19th century, as many of you probably know, in fact, for the entire first third of the 19th century, the major sources of energy that were used in much of Western European manufacturing and transportation were what we would now call renewable. And these included kind of animal power, animal locomotion, metabolic power, and natural resources. Now, in Great Britain, the second half of the 18th century witnessed this enormous expansion of the canal system, which is why I've brought up these two images here, which are not really part of the book project, but, Constable's such a famous figure of 19th century landscape painting. And here we can see him thinking about waterways. And this canal system really facilitated the swift transportation of goods across the country, including coal on barges, which were often pulled by horses, these larger barges. And many of you may be familiar with the term the flow, as Andres Malm uses it to describe this kind of energy economy. So the use of wind to propel sea travel, for example, and the use of water, not only here for transportation, but especially to power mills. And the flow, as a kind of energy, was characterized by the fact that this power fluctuated temporally. It was not kind of constant. It was location dependent, and its supply was not reduced through use. Hence, it's sort of renewable. And let's see, Constable actually pictures what might appear, I think, especially to us in the 21st century, to be a world characterized by the persistence of centuries-old agricultural practices, a cyclical way of life structured by seasonal change, and an accompanying social world marked by intergenerational transfer and stability. And so in the background of this painting, for instance, you can look across this expanse of water fields that at least appear to be kind of untouched by the introduction of industrial farming practices. And in the distance, the tower of Dedham Church. It's just sort of right in the very center of the painting, this little tower cropping up. And the church would be kind of yet another symbol of, it would seem, of kind of endurance and the perpetuation of traditional aspects of British rural life across the centuries. But locks, like the one that you see in the foreground here, this is a lock in the River Stour, were actually forces of modernization, insofar as they were connecting rural Britain in new ways and providing routes for the circulation of goods and people with unprecedented ease and unprecedented speed. This is before, of course, the railroad really snakes its fingers into the countryside. That's not going to happen for about another 20 years. Now, Constable was hardly one to be kind of frankly documenting the enormous changes that the English countryside was undergoing in the early 19th century. But he is known for trying to accommodate multiple, sometimes kind of incompatible time scales in his paintings. So the fleeting accumulation of cloud formations on the one hand, and then these allusions to multi-generational land management in the other. For instance, in his most famous painting, probably the Haywain, where you see on the left this cottage, which was inhabited by a tenant father on his father's estate. Now, to switch to a different picture, actually a little earlier, Joseph Wright of Derby, working in a quite different register, here portrays the world's first water-powered cotton spinning mill, which was built by Richard Arkwright in, I think, 1771. And with some of the themes that have been drawn out in the Constable, you can see, I think, the waterway coming through the foreground. That is the power supply for the mill, and then along it, this embankment where you see horses being drawn. So this conjunction of water power, the flow of water power, and animal locomotion. These are the kind of staples of a kind of early industrial energy economy in Britain. And Wright of Derby, in embedding these in a landscape that's looks very much like the kind of pastoral landscape that was most popular at the time. So for instance, this framing device of having an area in shadow in the immediate foreground, some kind of general symmetry and balance, but also with a path for the eye to take through the painting, this golden light that's falling on the scene, the kind of pictorial harmony of these elements. We could think then about Wright of Derby, essentially picturing a form of early industrial manufacturing that is seamlessly integrated with the kind of pastoral landscape tradition of academic art and the Arcadian world that it's associated with. And for those of you who haven't read Fossil Capital, it really has, it raises major questions for how we talk about British landscape in this moment. I think the field of art history has yet to come to terms with them, because essentially he's an economic historian, and he argues that we make an error when we assume that coal was gradually adopted in the 19th century because it was cheaper and it was more powerful. And in fact, what he argues is that when British industrialists adopted fossil fuel around 1830, water remained cheaper, more reliable, and was at least as powerful as coal. I'm not going to dwell on any of this material, but I bring it up to kind of set the stage for how we could revisit landscape paintings with an eye to their portrayal of energy regimes and to the social formations that accompany them. So what I'll do now is switch to France, and first I'll speak about forests, and then I'll turn finally to some German geology. Okay, so an unexpected place, I think, to begin discussing the French timber industry would be this 18th century painting of the new French king, Louis XVI, and his young family wandering the grounds of Versailles on a cool wintry day, a bit like today. And Hubert Robert's painting, I think we normally assume, articulates a sort of a decidedly Enlightenment model of monarchical authority, in which the king's power is reflected in his ability to shape the natural environment and apply kind of modern Enlightenment ideas to landscape management, and management of natural resources. So here, the emblem of his sovereignty is not the fleur-de-lis, or even one of these sort of grand statues that's in the grounds of Versailles, but actually, I think this massive felled tree in the very center foreground of the composition that sort of juts out awkwardly to the foreground, almost like an orthogonal line that's been misplaced. Now, by the late 18th century, many of the trees had been planted by Louis XIV's landscape architect. They'd grown really old, and the woods had kind of fallen into decline. And actually, one of the very first decisions that Louis XVI made during his reign was to clear them, and as part of this larger project to renew the grounds of Versailles. But to focus on the purely kind of political and emblematic resonances of the felled tree in the foreground would be, I think, to overlook a much more immediate historical context for understanding the painting and the power relations that it diagrams. Because, of course, in the 1770s, which was a period racked by widespread timber shortages and violent grain riots, the tree that is foregrounded here in kind of a bit in shadow in the center of the composition was increasingly understood as what we now call a natural resource. It was an entity whose status and use were contested by the very parties divided by this tree's placement within the painting. So the power of the state on the right, resplendent in silk garments, and the rural laborers on the left, who rest among this sort of shadowy earth and debris. Both the conflict and its anticipated outcome are alluded to in the children's game of seesaw, for which the tree serves as a base. If you look carefully, I think you can see that children are playing seesaw on it. The smooth rectangular wooden plank into which the trunk will be converted, and in this process become timber, become a commodity, signals its future as a commodity, having shed the irregularities that root its organic formation to a specific time and place. So as the tree becomes made into timber, it's going to become a kind of one of a series of identical or nearly identical units. And the fortunes of the children on the right will rise with it, the children of France's upper class, buoyed up by that commodity, while those on the left will be brought low. So when I'm looking at kind of timber management and forest management for this project, I'm especially interested in duration, the durational nature of the forest and its entwinement with sort of specific social formations, and also, I think, extractive models perhaps of both resource management and of looking. That's good here. Okay, so throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, European powers were ravenous for timber. Wood was not only the most ubiquitous element of building construction and the primary source of domestic heat, but it was also vital to building the large ships that would enable economic and imperial expansion. And whereas the Dutch and English relied a fair amount on imported timber, France was really the only major European Western European nation with sufficient woodlands to supply themselves. This was an unusual strategic advantage that France had as it's competing with kind of English and Dutch empires. So to capitalize on this, Louis XIV's Minister of Finance, you see on the left here, Colbert, had underseen the creation of a new legal ordinance that would mandate a top-down, state-regulated interventionist system of forest management. I won't get into what it says in here, but there were things like the Navy was granted exclusive rights to any trees that they wanted, in part because the tall, thick trees that you need for the mast of a large ship are quite rare. But it also meant that private landowners, including aristocrats, required the permission of the crown to fell trees. And there were also restrictions placed on the long-standing customary use rights traditionally granted to rural communities, which relied upon forest access, of course, for a wide range of purposes. And through its efforts to centrally regulate a geographically dispersed resource, the ordinance constituted the kind of large-scale management project that was central to the formation of modern bureaucratic nation states. And the book, Seeing Like a State, is really good on this. So the Ordinance of 1669 presumed that the long-term interests of the state stood at odds with the more immediate interests of both landowners who might wish to profit off of the clearing of trees and rural populations that relied and had relied for centuries on woodlands for food and for medicine, as pasturage for their livestock, bark that would be used in tanning, and fallen branches, which were widely relied on for firewood. And the changes that the ordinance implemented are, I think, an essential precondition for the operations of capitalist resource extraction, which Joanna Dolan and Martin Fredrickson have argued first entails the conversion of resources that were formerly perceived as common into private property. Now, in the 18th century, treatises emerged to advise on forest management, and this marks a kind of a new understanding of woodlands as something like a conglomerate of trees, trees whose growth could be optimized in line with ascendant technocratic principles, rather than viewed as a kind of diverse habitat in which many valuable plants and animals should thrive. And this is a process that Dolan and Fredrickson call unbundling, whereby certain aspects of a natural environment are treated as distinct or separable from a landscape in which they are embedded, which enables their subsequent extraction. So the treatise on forest management that I'm showing you here, kind of ominously titled On the Exploitation of Trees, but exploitation, it wasn't quite as menacing in the French, provided illustrations not only for the techniques of felling trees and producing charcoal, but it also offered things you see here, like this Cartesian grid against which the concentric rings of a trunk could be measured in order to estimate the age and weight of a given tree. And the suggestive power of this diagram, I think, implies that organic growth could be abstracted and rationalized according to mathematical principles, and reflects a broader trend towards a sustainable yield theory of forest management, which I won't get into here. But what I want to pull out of this is that the most recalcitrant problem of forests remained time. Forests require an unusually long-sighted form of planning because many species take over decades to reach maturity, and several require, 50 years, 80 years. So replenishing or even just maintaining France's stock of trees was an intrinsically kind of intergenerational, multi-generational undertaking. And this is what Julian Norblad, I think, evocatively calls the long-termism of the forest. So you have some who are charged with kind of shoring up multi-decade prosperity, which relied on old growth trees for things like shipbuilding, and their interests were, of course, at odds with the owners of private woodlands and of heat-powered forges. And they're also operating on conflicting timescales, kind of motivating these two groups. And so actually when the Diderot's Encyclopédie actually defined a forest, it reflects on this conflict. And in English, it says public vigilance must oppose the misplaced greed of those who want to sacrifice the duration of their woods to the profit of the moment. So durationality and short-term profit are seen as, and this conflict is seen as somehow actually kind of central to how trees are being understood. Okay, so then coming back to Robert's painting, we could see that perhaps it envisions a harmonious or at least a balanced distribution of these varying temporal horizons. The transactional fluctuations of profitability signaled by the seesaw game in the foreground, played using a plank of timber, are dependent, of course, on the multi-decade growth that has endowed the large felled trunk with its dimensionality and solidity. They are paired entities materially and pictorially. So it suggests a natural environment that is a site kind of laden with conflictual uses and claims, but pictured so as to allow us to imagine their resolution. Nature is resource, nature is respite, the profits of the present day, the duration of the woodlands, localized communal use of forests versus their consolidated management under a centralized state. And so on. And I think that's kind of the shorthand for this I see is the seesaw and the tree trunk. Okay, well, then several decades later, landscape is gaining prestige and popularity as an artistic genre in France. And in 1816, the nation's National Art Academy actually created a prize dedicated specifically to landscape painting. It was a competition loosely based on something they already had for history painting. And in this competition, candidates were evaluated on the basis of these increasingly difficult tasks. And this competition for landscape painting began with the dreaded tree exam, which actually some artists have written very funny memoirs about or kind of allusions to. And for the tree exam, this was your first hurdle. Artists would be asked to depict a specific species of tree from memory. And the eventual winner of that first competition, Michalon, who you see here, he had really trained for this task. His instructor had published a series of lithographs of tree studies, not unlike the one by Alexander Cozens on the left, which I'm showing you. And although Michalon's beech tree, again, focusing on this painting of the right, occupies the kind of full vertical expanse of this painting, it has very few sort of particularizing features beyond the general patterning of its bark and the shape of the trunk and the branches. So you will notice roughly symmetrical slender trees just behind it on either side, acting as a decorative framing device. And the tree's kind of pictorial priority is further secured in the form of this kind of yellow-hued light on the left and right of the beech tree, which set it apart from its surroundings. They form this kind of luminous perimeter around the beech. And so Michalon's study was, it was just a study, right? It's a painterly sketch whose utility, whose value resided in its ability to kind of record characteristics of a tree for later inclusion in the kind of studio-based historical landscape painting that you see on the left. So, the composition, I think, really reflects this instrumental approach insofar as it presents a tree in a manner that will facilitate its pictorial mobility, right? The viewer can easily kind of pick it out. And the way that it's formally distinguishable from its surroundings, we might think of this as maybe unbundled or unbundable, also coincides with the fact that it's kind of isolatable, dislocatable. This tree on the right is readied for circulation within an economy of pictures. So while what we see on the right might appear to be a harbinger of new forms of naturalism in French landscape painting, I think that it's marked by an allegiance not only to academic historical landscape painting, but also to a way of thinking about the natural world as an assemblage of resources from which trees can be exerted and set into circulation. Once inserted into the kind of large-scale historical landscape that you see on the left, which could be exhibited at the salon and sold to a wealthy patron, the beech could yield real monetary profit. And the process resembled, albeit indirectly, the routine conversion of trees into timber. So the beech was kind of leveraged in the service, I think, of kind of academic landscape painting's historical imperatives. So we might see this study on the right as inseparable from a larger kind of extractive mode of conceptualizing the natural world. Its formal isolation of the beech tree producing pictorial effects analogous to those prized within ascendant forest management and the growing timber industry. I won't talk about this. There are larger questions here about what it might mean to speak of viewing practices in terms of extractive looking, and on the contrary, what it might look like for artworks to demand a very slow form of parsing what it portrays. And I have quite a lot in this chapter on work by, for instance, Paul Huet and also Theodore Rousseau, who was actually trained, or he was sort of an apprentice secretary to someone who worked in the timber industry when he was a child. So can a painting ask a viewer to participate, for example, in a form of kind of perceptual long-termism, whereby they are made to kind of extend their durational experience of the painting in ways that cannot be kind of quickly instrumentalized? Those are the sorts of questions about viewing practices that I'm trying to explore here. So a few kind of brief words about German mining, right? And I should say Catherine Klinger at UCL wrote a really wonderful PhD about German mining and romantic art. So if you'd like to read about that specifically, I'd be really happy to direct you to her work. And as with the forest chapter, I'm really looking here at ideas about how, about space and time and causality, and how these are being formulated in the German study of geology, mineralogy, and mining, and then surfacing in late 18th and early 19th century visual culture. So I'll begin with this geological diagram, which shows rock kind of stretching deep into the earth in these layered deposits of sandstone and shale, whose limits extend far beyond the pages of the plate, suggesting their kind of abundance. And this engraving of the Harz Mountains, which was first published in 1785, depicts the kind of textured surface of a quarry, which is recessed into a grassy landscape. And if you look carefully, you'll see on the right a single figure who is ascending a hill towards a built enclosure. And then on the left, by contrast, kind of the curtain of the Earth's surface has been cut away to reveal a hypothetical cross-section of its unseen depths. The composition then divides somewhat symmetrically the realm of the human from that of the geological, with the quarry in the center acting as a kind of intermediary, which makes sense, of course, because the quarry face is, after all, the site where matter is kind of unearthed by human labor and converted into resources. But within a few decades, the preferred geological illustration of choice looked rather different, and this one is extremely famous. So here you will notice that decorative elements borrowed from topographical landscape painting have been abandoned, and the human figure is excluded altogether. Instead, you see rock strata organized exclusively along a vertical axis, whose annotations reflect both their relative depth and the geological era in which they were thought to have formed. So in this kind of diagram, which is called a stratigraphic diagram, of course, geological history is coming into view, pictured as a function of depth. The distinction between these kinds of illustrations may seem subtle, but these are actually reflecting kind of a broader scientific preoccupation with the relative age of different rock formations. Whereas the cross-section of the Harz Mountain integrates the human scale and the geological scale, whose compositional elements were presented in a kind of symmetrical balance, maybe even harmony. Let's see, I've lost my place. human elements were purged in the later stratigraphic illustrations, or sometimes relegated to a small detail across the uppermost strata, along with something like the mise-en-scène of a landscape. In the decades that intervened between these two prints, of course, some of you may know that scientists and savants were coming to terms with kind of radically new accounts of how and when the Earth was formed. And the chronological scale to measure geological history continually expanded as naturalists attributed ever greater depths to the world. We can think of the human figure in this illustration on the left as almost in a sense shrinking. I'm sure many of you know that this was articulated most powerfully in the phrase deep time by James Hutton, who's actually a gentleman farmer from Fife, where I'm speaking to you from. And I've written a bit about this a few years ago in representations if you're interested in hearing more about it. But we could think now about another totally different way that the human and the natural, or the human and the geological, are being pictured together in this moment, which would seem to be completely different, seeming to show kind of human mastery over geological phenomena. This is by the German romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich, who was known for his love of the Harz Mountains, which you saw that diagram of a moment ago. And this seems to be a really different encounter in the early 19th century between the human and the geological. So this figure is standing on a granite outcropping and kind of surveying rocky mountain formations, which are shrouded in mist below him, and these kind of faintly rendered peaks that flicker into view in the distance. Now, the figure's physical elevation over the landscape and his panoramic view suggest this fantasy of kind of visual possession and perhaps even physical mastery by the human subject. And for this reason, this painting is long served as a kind of art historical shorthand for German Romanticism in general, and more recently, in the last few decades, as a kind of emblem for early 19th century bourgeois subjectivity and its concomitance with the rise of modern spectatorial practices. So these are kind of bourgeois fantasies of autonomy, which are predicated on the optical appropriation of the natural world. But no, I guess I'll leave it on that for just a moment. Looking back to these previous illustrations, though, you can these diagrams, you can see that there are significant challenges being posed to the dominance assumed by the very model of subjectivity that is supposedly being pictured in a painting like this. And we might rethink that narrative that we have about it. Could this figure be poised kind of not on a precipice, but perhaps along a widening fault line between conflicting models of human and natural time? And that is in part because von Trebre's illustration, and that was the earliest diagram I showed you, and Friedrich's paintings are not as intellectually and historically distant from each other as we might assume. Mining and geology were important elements of a constellation of cultural practices within which European thinkers like Friedrich engaged with and conceptualized nature. And it would have been difficult, as Theodor Ziolkowski writes, to assemble a group of intellectuals in any of the centers of German Romanticism without having some figures who were somehow involved in mining in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So both Johann von Goethe and Georg von Hardenberg, who's better known as Novalis, major literary figures in German Romanticism, they were both employed overseeing regional mines. And Goethe even wrote rapturous lines about geological formations in 1785 essay Über den Granit. And as we also know, Friedrich himself possessed a genuine interest in geology and mountaineering, and he lived right by what you see on the screen, which was one of Europe's foremost centers of geological research. Friedrich lived right by it for most of his adult life. Novalis studied there, Alexander von Humboldt studied there. So it actually seems quite reasonable to understand that Friedrich's work might have both practical and conceptual points of contact with ideas about mining and geology. So And I'm wrapping up here. I'd say, rather than the assertion of bourgeois subjectivity predicated on the visual consumption of the natural world, we might instead, with this Friedrich painting, be confronting a conception of geological time that stands at odds with human historical time and the perceptual experience of the human subject. So here, to speak of extractive looking, to speak of unbundling, and to speak of long-termism raise quite different questions than I think we confront when we're looking at the forests. Elizabeth Miller, in a wonderful recent book on literature and extraction, points out that this underground extraction of resources, while there aren't differences between whether you're extracting, say, coal or gold, what they shared was the use of steam for the draining of mines, and the use of steam for crushing ore, and the transportation of mined commodities. Virtually every technological component, she writes, of the extraction supply chain was accelerated phenomenally by steam power. So you actually have this kind of metabolic feedback loop that's unique to this specific kind of way of dealing with a natural resource. And secondly, of course, all the materials being mined are materially finite and non-reproducible, at least not within anything like a human timescale. And to these observations, I might add that things like coal seams exist obviously outside of, for instance, the horizon line, which is a major structuring principle in Western art, and especially the landscape tradition since the early modern period. So to summon a perceptual experience of timeframes and vertical spatial recessions whose scales really defy representational conventions might be to invent, in a sense, a whole new model for how we as humans relate to them.